Hi, welcome to the LexCode channel where we learn to code together. This video is a part of series called Learn C# for Game Development, where we learn the basics of this programming language to later use it in game development with Unity. Today we're going to be talking about loops, so let's get right into it. And before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment under the video. This will help me a lot with the algorithm, so thank you very much in advance. So, what are loops? Loops are a programming concept that allows us to repeat code for a number of times or until a certain condition is met. Why are they useful? Imagine you need to print numbers from 1 to 5. And you can go about it by writing 5 console write line statements. But then, let's say you need to print numbers from 1 to 1000. Would you keep writing those console write line statements? Sounds pretty insane, right? Another approach here would be to use a loop, which gives you a much simpler way to write that same logic. And here's the example on the screen. This particular piece of code will print numbers from 1 to 1000, and if you want to print numbers from 1 to 1,000,000, you would just change the number here. So the amount of code stays the same. Let's dive deeper into the syntax of loops and see what all of this means. There are two main types of loops, for loop and while loop. We will start by taking a look at the for loop, so let's do exactly that. We write the for loop by starting with the keyword for, then we put the parentheses, and inside the parentheses we have three main parts. First, we initialize a variable. This is going to be our iterator, so the convention here is to name it I for iterator, because this is a variable that's going to keep the number of iterations in the loop. We usually start by initializing it to 0, and as our loop progresses, its value increases. Another approach would be to start by a certain number and then decrease it as we go, but the general convention here is to start with 0. Then we write the condition. Basically, what we're saying here is we want this loop to keep running as long as this condition is true or until it becomes false. So in our case, our loop is going to be running as long as I is less than 5. And as the last part, we increase our iterator by 1. So here we say what we want to happen when each iteration ends. And by the end of the iteration, we want to increase the value of I by 1. Once I reaches the value of 5, our loop will stop. And then we put the square brackets, and inside the square brackets, we say what we want to happen for as long as our loop is running. In this case, we're going to be printing the value of I, our iterator, on each iteration of the loop. This will output the following result, numbers from 0 to 4. And the reason why it prints numbers from 0 to 4 is we say we want the loop to be running and printing the value of I as long as it's less than 5. So it will stop once I reaches the value of 5 and will not print that value. If we wanted to also print I when it reaches the value of 5, we would go about it that way. We would say, as long as I is less than or equal to 5, we want our loop to keep running. And in this case, it will output the values from 0 to 5. Another type of loops is the while loop. And the while loop is kind of similar to the if statement. We say while, put parentheses, and then check for a condition. Only with the while loop, instead of returning true or false, it keeps whatever is inside of it running as long as that condition is true. That's why with the while loops, here we initialize an iterator outside of the loop and then change its value inside of the while statement. So we have our variable count here equal to 0, and as long as count is less than 5, we want to print its value and then increase it by 1. So if I were to put a condition that will always be true, like just saying true is always equal to true, or if I forgot to increase the value of count at each iteration, our loop would run forever. This is a common mistake known as infinite loop, so try to avoid it and make sure your loop always has a condition that will eventually become false. Another type of loops worth mentioning is the do-while loop. It's very similar to the while loop, but the only difference here is that the while loop will first check for a condition and then execute the code inside the curly brackets, whereas the do while loop will first run that code and then check for the condition to see if it should keep running. We'll take a look at the example where using a do while loop could backfire when writing code. So let's do exactly that and move to the Visual Studio. So I'm here in the IDE and let's write some code to practice loops. Let's start with something simple and write a for loop to print numbers from 0 to 4. So we're going to say for int I equal 0. While I is less than 5, we're going to increase I by 1 and print the following code. We're going to say console writeline I. Let's run that in the console. Let's see what happens. And we can see that the numbers from 0 to 4 were printed. Once again, as I mentioned in the presentation, if we want to print the numbers from 0 to 5, then we would simply go ahead and put an equal sign here, which would mean while I is less than or equal to 5, we want to print its value. Now let's try and print that. And yes, as you can see, it prints the values from 0 to 5. What if we want to print numbers from 1 to 5? Well, in this case, we'll just go ahead and we'll initialize I to be equal to 1. And in this case, we'll be starting to count from 1. And numbers from 1 to 5 will be printed. Now let's take a look at another example of a while loop. So once again, let's take the same one from the presentation. We're going to initialize our variable here. It's going to be iterator, and it's going to be equal to 0. And then we're going to say while iterator is less than 5. We're going to print its value. So we're going to say iterator. And then very important, don't forget to increase its value by 1. Otherwise, our loop is going to run forever. So at the end of our statement here, we want to say iterator plus plus. And that way, our loop will eventually stop once the iterator will reach the value of 5. So let's run that and take a look. And yes, as you can see, the result is the same. It prints the values from 0 to 4. Alright, now let's take a look at the example with the do while loop. Right, we're going to comment this out here. And we're going to say do. And after do, we put the code that we want to run. So what we want to do, we want to once again print the value of iterator and then increase its value by 1. And then we say while iterator is less than 5. And then we put the semicolon. So let's run that code and see if it works. And yet, as you can see, it prints the numbers from 0 to 4. And here you might have a question. So what's the difference between the while loop and the do while loop? And the difference, as I've already mentioned, is that do while loop will first execute this part of code and only then check the condition, while the while loop will first check the condition and then print the code. So when could it be wrong? For example, our iterator will have an initial value of 6. So already we can see that it doesn't match the condition, right? If we just had the while loop, then it wouldn't run at all because it doesn't pass the initial condition. But the do while loop will first run that code and only then check if it should continue. So let's take a look. And yes, as you can see, it prints the value of 6 and only then it stops because it first prints the code and then checks for that condition. So that's the main difference between the while loop and the do while loop. Alright, so now that we've seen some simple examples of loop, let's go ahead and write a program. I'm going to erase all of that. And let's say we want to make a program that asks our user for a number and then prints all numbers from 1 up to that number. So let's start by writing a prompt, and we're going to say console writeline, print any number, and I will count from 1 up to that number. Then, as we already know, we want to read the input from the user and store it in a variable. So let's say int number is going to be int.parse. Don't forget about that part because we will use console readline, but it only can output a string. So we will need to convert that string into an integer, and that's what this function does. So then we're going to say console.readline. And now that we have that value from a user, we want to count from 1 up to that number. And this is where a for loop comes in. So let's say for int I equal 1. So in this case, we want to start counting from 1, not to 0. And then we will say I is less than or equal to number, because we want to count up to that number. So we want to print that number as well. And in this case, we don't have a particular value. We don't know up to which number we want to count. So we will take the value from that variable and put it here. And we're going to count up to that value. And then we want to say I++. So we're going to increase our iterator. And then, yeah, very simply, we want to say console writeline. And let's put something interesting here. So number, and then say number. All right, well, let's see if that works. So let's run our program. Print any number, and I will count from 1 up to that number. So let's say 10. Something went wrong. Let's see what happened. Of course, I put number here instead of our iterator. That's why it always outputs the number. So let's say I here, because we want this value and not that value to be output. So let's try again. Let's try again, 10. And there you go. It says number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, cool. It works. Now, let's say we want our program to keep running non-stop until our user decides to stop. Maybe they want to test several numbers, and then they would have to like reopen the program every time, which is not very convenient, right? And this is another situation where loops become handy, where we want our programs to run continuously until something happens. So let's say in our case, we want our program to keep running until user enters 0. So a user can enter any value and we will count up to that. But if they enter 0, then we will stop our program. So how do we go about that? First of all, we want an infinite loop running. And in this case, it would be great to use the while loop. So we can do just that. We'll say while, and then an infinite condition would be true. True always equals to true. And then we want to write all that code inside our while loop. The only problem right now is that if we try to run that code, it will run forever. The program will keep running and prompting the user and printing the number non-stop. So we need a condition for it to stop. And the best place to put that condition is after we get the input from a user. So as we said, when they input 0, we want to stop our program. So inside our loop, we can go ahead and say if number is equal to 0, and here we want to say that we want to stop our program. And the way to do this, we can say break. So break is a keyword that we can use to exit the loop before it does that itself, or we put a condition that will run forever, like true. So in this case, if we input the number 0, the loop will break and the program will stop running. Let's test that out. So let's try again, put 10. And as we can see, it prints the numbers from 1 to 10, and then it prompts us again. And then let's say 5. It does the same thing. And now we want to put 0, press enter, and our program exits. And a good way to optimize it is to put an empty constant write-line statement here to separate the end of the part of the program, and then another prompt. And also here, we want to say 0 to exit, just so our users know that this is a possibility. So let's test that program. Print any number, and I will count from 1 up to that number, 0 to exit. So let's try again. Let's try 5. Okay, it works. And if we put 0, press enter, our program stops. These were the loops in C#. Let me know if you have any questions left in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.